the COVID tragedy, we can say now we know better that also health is so important. Without health, everything is nothing, as Schopenhauer said in the past. So I think we should consider the importance of all SDGs, and make sure that our degree programs in UNICA universities also will pay enough attention to all of them. Also considering some SDGs, which we have to say in our societies have been quite neglected, like no poverty, number one, no hunger, zero hunger. I mean, these are, I think, key SDGs that we really have to try to achieve very soon. And I have to say that the rankings that the Times Higher Education launched some time ago is very useful, because I think it helps universities to focus more on these topics, because the rankings assess universities against the SDGs, making comparison across research, outreach, and stewardship. So in a way, we know in UNICA and in other university associations, we have been rather critical against rankings. We know that rankings cannot measure, in a very precise way, the quality of universities. But on the other hand, rankings can also be an incentive for our universities to look more carefully at these topics, to measure what we are doing. So I think this is the reason why we started, and personally I was so much interested in cooperating with the Times Higher Education, and in particular with Duncan Ross, on this topic, because I think, again, can be useful to spread the information about these rankings and see how UNICA, each of us, is performing on that. We have an excellent lineup of speakers, so I will not take too much of your time at this moment. I want to thank, since this very first moment, all the speakers who accepted to speak at this webinar. I know we have a very high number of participants online, so thanks to all of you for taking the time for participating in this webinar. And also want to thank very much the UNICA office for participating, and in particular Vicky Xonka, Laura Brossico, and Laura Colo, who are also online with all of us. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to the first speaker. We have the pleasure to have Ramu Damodaran, who is a Deputy Director for Partnerships and Public Engagement, Outreach Division of the Department of Public Information of the United Nations. Thank you very much, Ramu, and you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Luciano. It's wonderful to see you having made the reverse trip that Hannibal did, crossing the Alps from Rome northwards to Switzerland. And thank you, Vicky, for arranging all of this. We had a meeting of the United Nations Committee on Information last week, and our lead technical expert was also conducting our meeting from Budapest. So I think Hungary has something which India will soon be envious of. Thank you for that, and thank you to our wonderful Laura's for all your support to this. To be the first speaker at an event like this is both an advantage and a disadvantage. An advantage normally in the sense that you can say things before other people say them, but also a disadvantage in the sense that you cannot either borrow or react to points that others have made. But I'm grateful for this opportunity because I think, in a sense, I'm the one non-expert in the room. I mean, I do deal with education, as I will explain, but I'm by no means a practitioner. I'm not a teacher. I'm not a scholar. I'm really a beneficiary of education. And I think, particularly now in 2020, all of us in the world, and particularly all of us at the United Nations, are similar beneficiaries. I was very struck, Luciano, by the publication that you and Laura Brasecco authored a few months ago in the context of COVID, where you said, universities must stay close to the community and subtly, and I repeat that word, subtly advise governments and help the authorities in combating the situation of COVID. They must be at the forefront of research on areas that have to do with COVID-19, and encourage collaboration and exchange of good practices with fellow institutions to come out of the situation as strong and as united as possible. And when I read that, and I read it at a time when the intensity or the unpredictability of COVID was even more intense than it is now, strangely the thought occurred to me how this idea of universities subtly advising authorities would really be ingrained into the larger concept of human development, particularly in our focus today, sustainable development, and how important it was, no matter what means we use, and some means are bound to be controversial, whatever means we use to be able to measure those. And that really brings us to the question that Duncan is leading on, the question of ranking. So I'd like to begin by really reflecting on two anniversaries. One just 40 years ago, the other 175 years ago. The anniversary 40 years ago, and this is something which all of you based in Europe will relate to, because in a sense, it really set the pace for what happened in the 1980s and beyond. And that was the founding at the end of August 1980 of Solidarność, Solidarity, the movement in Poland led by Lech Walesa. The fact that the worker in a clearly totalitarian state would summon the energy of his people against an oppressive government was something totally new to what we call the Eastern Bloc at that time. And I remember I was a very junior diplomat in Moscow, and I could see the sense of unease in my Soviet interlocutors soon after the protests in Gdansk and elsewhere in Poland began to cohese into this movement. And it's important because we often tend to forget or neglect history. It's important to think of that world in 1980 and the world immediately before that, because in a sense, and we're really in a European ambience and environment here today, it was not just Eastern Europe, it was even Western Europe. Luciano would remember that just 2 years before Solidarity in 1978, the brutal kidnapping and murder of Aldo Moro in Italy. So there was this latent undercurrent of violence, hostility, and protest against the state, which in the 1980s began to lead and finally coalesce into the events of 1989, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and then in the early 1990s, to the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. Why I want to bring this anniversary to your mind is because it offered an immense opportunity to be able to identify the one aspiration every human being has the world over, that is the right to development. And that right was, in a sense, coalesced and made more sophisticated in the early 21st century into what we call sustainable development. The other anniversary, as I said, is 175 years. And it's coincidentally on this date, on September the 9th, in 1845, that what is known as the Great Irish Famine, the potato famine, began. And that was a famine which took a toll of 1 million lives, and we are alarmingly approaching that figure in the pandemic that we have today. But the reason I particularly mention it is because it was later scholarship, including a member of UNICA like the University of Copenhagen, or a member of the United Nations Academic Impact like Cornell University, which concluded that the potato famine in Ireland had been caused by a fungus or a virus that originated in Mexico and had made its way eastward through the United States onto the continents of Europe. And that again brings to mind the quotation I shared with you from Luciano and Laura earlier. The fact that when you deal with something which is as transmittable as virus, you have to have both scholarship in hindsight, which becomes scholarship in foresight. And that, I think, is where scholarship is most relevant both to the Sustainable Development Goals and to what might derail it. Duncan has spoken about an even earlier pandemic and a much more severe one, the Black Death in the 14th century, which caused, I believe, around 6 million lives to be lost. And here again, you have a situation of where something which is as grim and foreboding as a pandemic can completely upturn society in some ways for the better. The fact that the Black Death caused the overthrow of feudalism because there was a labor shortage. The fact that the Black Death increased the participation of people in democracy by diminishing the power of the church. So when we use the phrase today about build back better, which is unfortunately become in a sense very trite, we do have historical precedent to go back on. And what this ultimately relates to our topic for today is that in the year 1999-2000, once we had these cumulative effects coming down the line of nations and governments that were either afraid of their own people or at the very least vigilant of their concerns and their interests, that these governments came together at an organization like the United Nations, which was conceived of essentially as an organization of states, of governments. It was not intended to be, even though the Charter begins the words "we the peoples," it was not intended to be a people's organization. And for the first 45, 50 years of the organization, it was really a collection, an alliance of extremely possessive governments that worked to contain their national interests and allow no other nation to impinge upon it. That changed with the Millennium Development Goals. And that was our first foray, if you will, into the idea that nations have an international responsibility to their own peoples. From that, we realized, and I'm giving you these punctuation marks because they're important, this happened in the year 2000. The time frame for the Millennium Development Goals was intended to be 15 years, till the year 2015. A number of things happened in that first decade of the 21st century, of which you're aware. We had natural disasters like the tsunami or the earthquakes in China and Pakistan. We had man-made disasters, the most dramatic of which was the bombing in New York in the year 2001 and all its repercussions in terms of global conflict and the struggle against terrorism. We had earlier precursors of disease, including SARS and MERS. So there were a number of factors in the first decade of the 21st century which set the Millennium Development Goals, if you will, off target. But ultimately, there was the ability to think these goals through and to realize that there would be opportunities to build upon them better, like Build Back Better. Then in the year 2010, we were asked at the United Nations to come up with a totally new idea, an alliance of universities and higher education institutions around the world, which could further what the United Nations wanted to do through their research and through their activities. And so we came up with the United Nations Academic Impact. And in our core principles for this academic impact, we did draw upon elements in the Millennium Development Goals, including eradicating poverty, for instance. But we introduced new elements which were not there in the MDGs. We introduced gender equality. We introduced peace and conflict resolution. We introduced an understanding of each other's cultures and the unlearning of intolerance. And so in many ways, I like to think, and obviously I'm biased, that we set the tone for showing what the global academic community is capable of in a scenario like this. And that then fed into the conversations which began 2 years later at the conference in 2012 at Rio, called the Rio +20 conference, the conference titled The Future We Want, which then led to the elaboration of the Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm not going to go into great detail about the SDGs, with which I'm sure are all familiar, but the precision of the SDGs, the fact that you have the 17 goals, but you also have 169 very quantifiable targets. The fact that individual nations and indeed provinces within nations have come up with their own reports on these goals is something which is really quite phenomenal, and which shows that governments need to do this not alone, but with the academic sector. Jonathan has spoken, had once quoted a lovely phrase of Charles Dickens when King's College in London began its evening classes, thus completely democratizing higher education. Charles Dickens said it opens the doors not only to education, but a higher life. And I like to think of that phrase because right now, for a vast majority of our world, that higher life is not the higher life of Socrates or Plato or even Luciano Schopenhauer. But it goes far beyond that to just the bare necessities of life, what we call sustainable development. And if higher education can open those doors, as Charles Dickens suggested, it's not only opening the minds of people, but allowing those minds to be open to allow those minds to liberate other bodies. And I think this is really where the SDGs have to come in. And the SDGs, by nature, are apolitical, as higher education itself needs to be. Sebastian has argued very forcefully about the irrelevance about Brexit to the EU, the right of the United Kingdom or its students to participate in Erasmus. Now that, to my mind, is exactly the rationale, if you will, of something like the SDGs. We are going to be in a society and in a time frame where universities need to lead both in terms of pedagogy, both in terms of internal example, how they function as institutions, as entities. How do they contribute to climate change and how do they alleviate that? How do they ensure the health of their workers and their students? So you have this multi-pronged approach. And that brings in the immediate question of how universities, particularly in probably the most historically intellectually rich continent in our world, the continent of Europe does. And your idea in UNICA of bringing together capital cities is a remarkable innovation for the very simple reason that you have universities at the headquarters of national governments, which by virtue of physical proximity, and I grant that today physical proximity is less important than it was 20 or 25 years ago, but still there is an immediacy when a university professor can walk into a ministry, or hopefully more likely a minister can walk into a university campus and learn. We at the Academic Impact have been privileged to have universities on the continent of Europe in capital cities contributing to the SDGs. We have the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens, their Energy Policy Institute, which has launched a Europe-wide initiative beginning in the Black Sea Economic Cooperation on the planting of trees to combat climate change. Some of you may have seen, and I realize, Duncan, may not be politically correct for me to quote The Guardian at a meeting where you are in the lead, but still you may have seen The Guardian today with this wonderful story about how trees can contribute to alleviating climate change if they're allowed to survive. If you plant a tree which will last only for 2 or 3 years, it's not going to do the purpose. And that's exactly what the Energy and Policy Institute is doing. You have the Carlos III University in Madrid, again a member, which is our SDG hub on cities, which is working both within the city of Madrid and elsewhere in Europe on the SDGs. So I wanted to suggest this because there is, to my mind, a two-pronged approach here. The first, the idea that the academic impact has been able to fortunately set the tone for what we call intellectually social responsibility. The second, and this has really been very tragically dramatized in the last 6 months, is that governments are listening to thought and reason. There are governments in the world today which are still political in nature. There is still an element of scholarship that remains outside the domain. Daniel has spoken about how, in many ways, our entire intellectual repertoire remains Anglo-Saxon, because it is written in the classical European languages, including English. But as he mentions, at some point with the growing importance of China, of Japan, of India, you will have a new global academic vernacular, which is important. So those are the thoughts that I wanted to leave with you, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion because, as I said, I'm coming to you from the point of view of a generalist. When the MDGs were devised, we realized that the most successful countries for the MDGs were countries like Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Netherlands, Japan. And someone came up with the idea that MDGs stood for monarchies do good. Let me suggest to you that SDGs stand for scholars do good. And I'm proud to be with you. Thank you.